Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. Storythan, my best friend, Maya, and I were history majors at Crestwood University, and we had this one incredibly intense professor, Dr. Alastair Finch, who specialized in American Gothic history, particularly local burial practices, which was honestly pretty fascinating, though definitely creepy. And for our final project, he offered an extra credit opportunity that was too good to pass up, spending a full weekend documenting the oldest, most ignored section of the town's primary burial ground, Blackwood Cemetery. We needed to document every headstone, cross-reference the names with old town records, and generally just make sense of the forgotten area. And the prize wasn't just the credit, it was access to Dr. Finch's private archives, which was like gold to us, so we packed up my beat-up '98 Honda Civic, loaded with gear, flashlights, a couple of older digital cameras, and plenty of cheap coffee, ready to spend a cold, late October weekend living the historian dream, even if it meant being surrounded by silent, crumbling monuments and the constant chill of the place. The cemetery itself was sprawling. The main section was manicured and pretty, but Blackwood was different. It was on a slight hill, bordered by an iron fence that was more rust than metal. And as soon as we got there, even as the sun was setting, everything felt still and heavy. But the first night was almost pleasant. Actually, we set up our little camp just outside the boundary wall and spent the twilight hours walking the rows. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the loudest thing, and Maya was taking detailed photos of the most weathered, barely legible stones, cracking jokes about angry spirits and local legends, which made the place feel less ominous, more like an atmospheric history classroom. And I remember thinking how cool this was, how close we were, just two friends chasing a history mystery, and the coffee was strong, and the camaraderie was perfect, and I thought, maybe horror movie rules don't apply to real life. Not to us. I'll skip the boring stuff, like setting up the tent and arguing about who got the last piece of cold pizza. But by Saturday afternoon, things started to feel a bit less fun. The air had turned genuinely cold, and the small incidents began. I was absolutely sure I had left my brand new, expensive laser measuring tape right by the old Holloway crypt, a distinctive gray stone monument with a cracked angel on top, because I had used it to measure the crypt's footprint just before lunch. But when I went back, it was gone, vanished, and I searched everywhere, even retraced my steps back to the car, but nothing. And when I asked Maya, she just shrugged, suggesting I must have packed it away without thinking, saying it was the kind of thing I always did, which, fine. Maybe I was a bit disorganized, but I knew I hadn't packed it, and the frustration was the first little crack in the comfort of our weekend. That night, the weirdness grew. Maya was asleep pretty early, exhausted from cross-referencing names in the town records book we'd brought. But I was restless, lying there in the tent, and I kept hearing this faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the older section, not loud, but persistent, like metal dragging over stone, and at first I told myself it was some animal, maybe a badger or a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady, and I remember feeling my stomach clench, and I finally got up, grabbing my flashlight, stepping out into the cold night, and the scraping stopped instantly the moment my foot hit the frosty ground, and the darkness felt heavier, somehow listening, and when I went back into the tent, Maya was sitting bolt upright, her eyes wide, whispering that she'd heard it too, but she quickly dismissed it again as wind in the fence or some kind of weird acoustic effect. But I knew it wasn't the wind, and the way she insisted it was nothing, almost too quickly, started to bother me more than the sound itself. Toothy escalation came Sunday morning. We were supposed to be packing up, but I was still irritated about the missing measuring tape, and I also couldn't find my small, leather-bound notebook, the one where I kept my preliminary sketches of the stone layouts and personal notes, which was another thing that I then knew I hadn't packed. And it was a tiny thing, but combined with the sounds in Maya's strange dismissals, a cold knot of paranoia was forming in my chest, and I decided to look through Maya's gear, just to settle my nerves. telling myself I was being ridiculous, that she wouldn't just take my things. But the nagging feeling was too strong to ignore, and I was going through her research backpack, a big canvas thing she always carried, and I found it, not the measuring tape, but something much worse, a small, black spiral-bound notebook. And it was hidden deep under her stack of town records. And it wasn't hers. It had a sticker on the front that read property of A. Finch. That's when it hit me. A sickening rush of understanding. I pulled the notebook out, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. And inside wasn't dry historical data, but dense, obsessive handwriting, and it wasn't Dr. Finch's hand. It was Maya's, but she had been meticulously copying his style, changing her handwriting to match his older, more formal script. And the notes weren't about the PR history of Blackwood. They were about the location, the layout, and specific directions on where to dig, referencing names we hadn't even found yet, like the Watcher and the Key Bearer. And then I saw the section about me, pages and pages of personal observations, things I'd told her in confidence, twisted into something dark, like Sarah as a useful distraction. Her nervousness is good cover, and below that, a sketch of the Holloway crypt, marked with an X, and beneath the sketch, a triumphant note, tape recovered, too loud, and the realization washed over me, a tidal wave of betrayal. She hadn't just not heard the scraping, she was making it, and she was playing a different game entirely, a game that involved the graveyard in a way that wasn't about history. It was about something buried, something specific and perhaps even recent. The climax was messy and terrifying. I confronted her right there by the tent, holding the notebook like a grenade, and she didn't deny it. She just turned stone cold, her eyes losing all the warmth I'd known for years. And she hissed that I wasn't supposed to find that I had ruined everything, and she actually lunged at me, trying to grab the notebook back, and we were struggling in the dirt, near the cold, silent stones, and I was screaming, terrified not of the dark, but of the stranger wearing my best friend's face. And luckily Dr. Finch, who was supposed to meet us later that afternoon, drove up early, his old sedan rumbling along the gravel path, and he saw the struggle, rushed over, and immediately recognized his own notebook. And Maya just froze, the strange, cold mask cracking, replaced by a desperate, panicked look, and he didn't even ask what was going on, he just grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for an older man, and calmly ordered her into the car, his voice low and serious, and he told me to get my things, right now, and not to leave his side. And he drove us both back to the university, calling the campus police on the way, and I remember looking back at Blackwood, the crumbling stones watching us leave, feeling like I'd just woken up from a nightmare, except I was missing my notes, my camera, and my best friend. The police got involved, but Maya's parents were rich and well connected, and the whole thing was quickly swept under the rug as a severe mental health break induced by academic pressure. And Dr. Finch, though deeply disturbed by the use of his materials, kept quiet, likely wanting to protect his reputation. But I know what I saw, and I know the danger I was in, and I never saw Maya again. She transferred out of the university a week later. No explanation, no goodbye, and for a few months, I thought it was over. But the fear didn't leave, and the ongoing threat is real. Just last month, I got a package in the mail unmarked, and inside was my missing laser measuring tape, cleaned and polished, and wrapped around it was a piece of parchment, brittle and smelling of damp earth, and written on it in that same disguised, elegant script was a single line. The Watcher waits, it's colder than you think, and I haven't slept right since, knowing that she's still out there, that she's still doing whatever terrible, hidden thing she was doing in that graveyard, and that she knows exactly where I am, and she wants me to remember Blackwood, always. Story 2E. My family, the O'Malleys, are a bit weird. I'll admit it, especially when it comes to the dead. We're not goths or anything, but we have this intensely serious, almost religious tradition of grave tending, which sounds harmless enough, but it's more than just putting flowers down. Our plot is at St. Jude's Cemetery, one of the oldest in the state, and every year, on All Souls' night, the entire extended family gathers there for what we call the long clean, and I guess I have to be defensive about it, because I know how strange it sounds to outsiders, but for us, It's a way of honoring our history, of keeping the names real, and there's a genuine, deep love for the quiet ritual of it. Or there was, anyway. The activity rules for the long clean are precise and non-negotiable. First, you arrive exactly at midnight, no earlier, no later. You must carry your own single kerosene lamp, and no modern lights are allowed. Cell phones stay in the car. And the most important rule, you only tend the stones within the O'Malley boundary, which is marked by 4 specific bronze lanterns we inherited, and you clean the marble with a specialized mixture of warm water, vinegar, and ground slate. The formula passed down through generations, and the rules were meant to honor the dead, ensuring peace and quiet during the process. And we were taught that the quiet of the night should only be broken by the scraping of the slate brush against the stone, and the low, muttered prayers of remembrance. And these rules made the night feel important, sacred, and they were always followed to the letter. Or so I thought. My first time leading a group was last year. I was given the northern quadrant, a small cluster of my great aunts and uncles, and I felt this rush of pride, finally taking a central part in the family tradition. And my initial participation felt strategy. Driven, I started with the most weathered stone, Great Uncle Eamon's, systematically brushing away the accumulated moss and grime, working slowly, letting the kerosene light illuminate the name carved into the granite. And for the first few hours, it was exactly as it always was, quiet, meditative, and just plain cold. And I was lost in the work, my heart feeling full with the weight of the family history around me. Hearing the soft, distant sounds of my cousins and aunts tending their sections, the occasional clink of a bucket, and the low murmur of my grandfather's voice near the main obelisk. And I was feeling good, accomplished, like I was finally earning my place. But then, something's wrong. Around 3 a.m., I noticed a new sound, not the usual scraping or quiet talking, but something else, a light tapping, fast and delicate, almost like fingernails on stone. But it wasn't coming from within our boundary, and I stopped working, held my breath, and listened, and the tapping was coming from the row right next to our plot, outside the bronze lanterns, an area that was definitely not O'Malley land. And as I shone my lamp toward the sound, I saw a figure, hunched low over a gray, unmarked slab. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. Too tall to be my mother, too thin to be my Uncle Patrick. And they were moving too quickly, their hands flying over the stone in a strange, frantic motion, and they didn't have a kerosene lamp. They were working in the complete dark, just a vague, shadowy shape against the deeper dark of the cemetery, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air, because we all knew the rule: you never, ever tend a grave that isn't yours. It's disrespectful to the others, a terrible breach of cemetery etiquette. I tried to tell myself it was just some other family doing their own thing, breaking the rules, but the feeling that this presence didn't belong, that it was fundamentally wrong, grew stronger, and the figure started to move, not walking, but gliding, a silent, impossibly smooth motion along the row of headstones. And as it passed under the faint moonlight, I realized the terrible truth, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. The threat wasn't from trusted people. The figure wasn't wearing the heavy, dark coats and work gloves we all wore, and it wasn't carrying a lamp or a bucket, and its face, or what little I could make out as it passed, was pale and stretched, too long, too smooth, and its movements were simply too fluid, not human in the way we understood it. And it was tapping, still tapping, its long, bare fingers drumming the tops of the stones as it moved toward the main O'Malley obelisk, toward my grandfather and the center of the gathering. And I should have been surprised when I saw that it was dragging something behind it, a heavy, dark shape that looked disturbingly like a large, rolled-up sheet of canvas. But I wasn't. I was just cold with pure, unadulterated fear. The chasing escape sequence that followed was a blur of terror. I dropped my brush and my lamp, screaming, a sound that seemed ridiculously loud in the sudden, absolute silence. And I started running, crashing through the brittle, dried grass toward the obelisk. And I yelled out my grandfather's name. But the figure turned instantly, its long, smooth form dissolving the silent glide into a fast, awkward loping run directly after me. And I remember the sounds, my own ragged breath, the frantic thump of my heart, and the sickening thud drag of the thing it was pulling on the frozen ground behind it. And I didn't look back. I just pushed through my cousins, scattering the family, yelling for them to run, to leave everything, to get out now. And my grandfather, confused and angry at the sudden disruption, grabbed my arm, demanding to know what I was doing. But I just pointed wildly back into the shadows where the thing was coming from, its pale shape now visible, and his face, usually so calm, went slack with sudden, paralyzing fear, and that was all the confirmation I needed. And we didn't stop running until we were through the rusted iron gates and into the car, driving away, watching in the rearview mirror as the entire section of the cemetery we'd been tending remained perfectly dark, perfectly silent, and unnervingly still. The aftermath was terrible. The family was angry, confused, and deeply shaken, and my grandfather, who had always been the rock, refused to talk about what he saw or what he felt, just insisting I had broken the sacred rules and imagined things in my panic. And the whole incident caused a huge rift, with people blaming my overactive imagination for ruining the tradition. But I know what I saw, and the unresolved mystery is worse than the encounter itself. We never went back to the cemetery, not as a family, and my grandfather sold the O'Malley plot boundary marker to a historical society a month later, pretending it was just to simplify things, and for months, things were quiet. But the lingering fear was always there, and then last week, a mysterious sign appeared. I was checking my mail, and tucked in among the bills was a small, square package, and inside was a clean, polished O'Malley bronze lantern, the one that had marked the northern quadrant, and tied to the handle with a piece of dark, fraying twine was a single, smooth slate tile, freshly engraved with the words, "Wyu farju tiu finas tiachi silian," and I know that tapping is still out there, that it followed me home, and that it's waiting for next All Souls night. Story 3, the motivation set up for me was pure desperation. I had just graduated with a degree in film studies, which basically meant I was extremely qualified to make a really intense documentary about how broke I was. And my debt was piling up. The rent on my tiny apartment was overdue, and I needed cash fast. So when I saw the online ad, sandwiched between data entry and babysitting for overnight security watchmen, historical site, it sounded too good to be true, and the pay was ridiculous, triple the minimum wage, which was exactly the money I needed, and the site. The famous, crumbling century, Old Willow Creek Memorial Park, which had been closed to the public for years, due to vandalism and strange activity, but they were supposedly doing a soft renovation, and needed a night watch, and the money wasn't worth it. But the debt was crushing me, and I had to take it, no matter how creepy it sounded. The planning phase was simple: meet the property manager, Mr. Silas, a stoic, silver-haired man who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1950, and he gave me the keys, a massive old-school brass flashlight, and a brief, unnerving tour. And the group dynamics were non-existent. It was just me alone, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. And he made it clear that my job was simple: patrol the perimeter, check the main mausoleum once an hour, and log any disturbances. And I kept asking what kind of disturbances, and he just smiled a thin, unsettling smile and said, "The usual." And that was the entire training, and my one friend, Chris, who was helping me move in some supplies, just kept telling me it felt wrong. The whole situation, the money, the location. But I just kept thinking about my looming eviction notice and the mountain of student loans. My arrival and first day was a lesson in atmosphere. Willow Creek Memorial Park wasn't just old. It was actively decaying. The wrought iron fence was choked with vines. The paths were cracked and overgrown with moss. And the main mausoleum, a towering granite structure with a black marble door, looked less like a tomb and more like a sleeping beast, and the air was thick, heavy, and smelled perpetually of damp earth and rotting leaves. But the initial atmosphere felt manageable, almost poetic, like working on a massive, Gothic movie set. And I drove my old beater into the service entrance, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel. And the moment the iron gates clanged shut behind me, the silence was absolute. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of things waiting. And I started my first patrol, clicking on the brass flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow, yellow path through the overwhelming darkness, feeling that mixture of nervousness, and the satisfaction of finally earning some real money. But even then, on that very first walk, something felt deeply, fundamentally off about the place, like the ground itself was angry I was there. The building tension started subtly on night 2, small conflicts with my own sense of reality. I'd log an event like gate check secure, and then 10 minutes later, I'd pass the gate again, and the heavy bolt, which required a significant physical effort to slide, would be resting in the open position, and I kept re-securing it, thinking I was just tired or forgetful. And then came the isolation. I tried calling Chris on my break, but my phone, which usually had 2 bars, was showing absolutely no signal, a dead zone that seemed to only exist within the park boundaries. And I walked the perimeter, telling myself it was just old wiring, or a localized tower issue. But the knowledge that I was cut off, that if anything happened, no one would know until morning, was a heavy blanket of dread. And that night, I started feeling like I was always being watched, not by a person, but by the very stones themselves, and every shadow seemed to hold a shape, just at the edge of my vision. The first incident was undeniable. Around 3 a.m., on night 3, I was logging my hourly check from the tiny security shed near the main entrance, when I heard a soft, beautiful, but impossibly clear sound of a child's music box coming from the main mausoleum, and the mausoleum was locked tight, triple, locked with a heavy chain and padlock, and I grabbed my flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I walked toward the structure, the light beam dancing nervously, and as I got closer, the music got louder, a cheerful tinkling melody that was horrifically out of place in that cold, silent grave, and then the music stopped, instantly, and a single thump came from inside the granite walls, like something heavy had dropped, and I froze, yelling out, "Hello, is anyone there?" And only the silence answered, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. The sound was too real, too close, and for the first time, I felt the cold sweat of genuine physical fear, the kind of fear that makes you want to drop everything and run. But I kept telling myself, the money, I just need to make it to 6 a.m. feck. The escalation was fast and personal. The next night, I found direct threats. My security shed, which I had locked behind me during my patrol, had been broken into, and the door wasn't forced. The lock was simply gone, resting innocently on the floor, and inside, my small supply bag had been ripped open, and my thermal coffee mug was smashed on the concrete floor. But the worst part was the threatening message left right on my logbook, scratched deeply into the vinyl cover with something sharp, something hard, the words scrawled in a frantic, almost unreadable hand, "Elevo your kuyuait," and below it a small, but recognizable sketch of the main mausoleum, and then, property damage. I walked toward the rear of the park, and found that the oldest, most delicate headstone in the entire memorial, a fragile, angle-winged stone from the 1850s, had been cleanly toppled over, resting face down in the mud, and the act wasn't vandalism, it was a deliberate show of force, a message telling me that whatever was here knew I was here, and it had the power to break things, even the things that were supposed to be sacred and untouchable. The escape and aftermath began immediately. I didn't wait for 6 a.m. I dropped the logbook right there, ran back to the entrance, fumbling desperately with the complex, antiquated keys, and I remember my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the lock to turn, and I was crying, not sobbing, but these silent, terrified tears of pure panic, and I finally got the gate open, threw myself into the car, and sped out of Willow Creek, not slowing down until I hit the city limits, and the next morning, I went straight to the police station, reporting the break-in, the threats and the damage, and the authority involvement was frustratingly dismissive. A young board officer took my statement, but when he went out with me to the park, the scene was different. The door of the security shed was securely locked, the smashed mug was gone, and the headstone was standing perfectly upright, cleaned and looking untouched. And the officer looked at me with open pity, suggesting I was suffering from work-related stress, which only solidified the unresolved questions. Was it all a sick joke? Was it the manager? Or was it something else? Something only visible when the park was alone, and the police couldn't find anything, closing the case as unsubstantiated claims, and I never got paid for those nights. But I didn't care, I just wanted out. But the worst part was my final interaction with the authority figure. I tried to call Mr. Silas, demanding an explanation, asking why the police couldn't see the damage, and he finally answered, his voice flat and unnervingly calm, and I asked him directly about the toppled stone and the break-in, and he simply said, "Oh, that old stone falls all the time, happens in these old places, and the shed lock is a bit fiddly." And then, the host authority figure being secretive about the location, he added, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Don't worry about coming back, Liam. We found someone else, someone who understands the quiet." And they made it clear that some things are meant to stay buried, and you didn't quite grasp that. And he hung up, leaving me with the knowledge that he knew exactly what was going on, and he was deliberately feeding the Willow Creek Memorial Park to whatever was demanding its quiet, and the sound of that music box still follows me, a constant, faint tinkle I hear whenever I'm alone in the dark. Story 4E, the inheritance setup was a complete shock. My estranged great-aunt Beatrice, the family's eccentric black sheep, passed away unexpectedly, leaving me, her only living relative, everything, which was apparently her massive, crumbling Victorian home and a deed to a private mausoleum, a stone crypt in the historic Greenleaf Cemetery. And my aunt was always a spooky figure, obsessed with death and the occult, and she had spent her life as a sort of death doula for the wealthy, helping them arrange their final rest, which meant she collected the most bizarre things, and I hadn't spoken to her in almost 10 years. But suddenly, here I was, an inheritor, the sole custodian of her secrets and her strange property, and I should have known better than to accept it. But the house, though needing serious work, was worth a fortune, and I was drawn by the promise of finally having something that was mine. My initial exploration was full of a strange, chilling sense of discovery. The house was a dust-covered museum of morbid curiosities, but the really strange stuff was in the basement, a low ceilinged room filled with shelves of ancient, leather-bound books and piles of strange cemetery materials, like tiny, rusted tools I couldn't identify, bundles of dried, unfamiliar herbs, and hundreds of small, polished granite pieces, each one carved with a single unfamiliar symbol. And I also found her journal, a large, heavy book bound in faded green velvet, filled with her meticulous, sloping handwriting, chronicling her life. But the later entries weren't about her clients, they were about the crypt, specifically, and the things she was bringing home from the cemetery. And she wrote about the exchange, and the weight of the stones, and the whole thing gave me a nasty, cold feeling in my stomach, like I was peering into something that should have stayed buried with her. The first manifestations began immediately, after I brought the green velvet journal and a small, smooth granite piece back to my apartment, dismissing all this as coincidence, just the natural settling of an old house, or my overactive imagination. But the small things started, like the lights flickering constantly, even after I had the wiring checked, and then the noise, a soft, persistent scratching sound that seemed to come from inside the walls, only at night. And I told myself it was mice, hiring an exterminator, but the sound didn't stop, and it wasn't the quick, frantic sound of an animal. It was slower, more deliberate, almost rhythmic. And one morning, I woke up to find a thin layer of fine, gray dust covering the dresser, right next to the granite piece, even though the window was shut tight. And the dust smelled exactly like the damp, rich earth of the crypt, a smell I'd only noticed briefly when I'd gone to inspect the mausoleum door, and the signs were all there, whispering that something wasn't right. The research phase became an obsession, driven by the increasing noise and the constant feeling of being watched, and I spent hours poring over Aunt Beatrice's journal, finally learning about my family members' true involvement with the cemetery, and her entries detailed a long history of my ancestors being the unofficial crypt keepers of Greenleaf, but not in a nice, historical way. It was a legacy of wardenship, protecting the living from something as inside the cemetery, something she called the sleepwalker, and she described a complex ritual involving the granite pieces and the correct positioning of the bodies, a practice she had continued, and I realized that those granite pieces were not mementos. They were seals, and her notes mentioned a recent, crucial error in the placement of the last seal, the one I had taken, and she wrote, in shaky, panicked handwriting, "I failed. The seal is loose. The balance will break. It will look for the next warden. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't inherited property. I had inherited a job, and the price of failure. The escalating activity was undeniable and terrifying. The scratching became louder, morphing into a sound like fingernails desperately dragging across stone. And one night, I saw it. I was standing in the living room, trying to force myself to believe I was just hallucinating, when a shadow detached itself from the wall. A tall, distorted figure that moved with a slow, agonizing limp. And it wasn't a trick of light. It was solid, dark, and its head was slightly tilted. And it moved toward me, and I screamed, stumbling backward, and it stopped just as quickly, dissolving back into the darkness. But it left behind a sickeningly clear proof, a perfect, clear handprint, outlined in that same cemetery dust, on my clean, white wall. A handprint with 4 long skeletal fingers. And I should have walked away, but the sense of responsibility, the inherited dread, held me in place, and the events were now affecting my daily life. I was terrified to sleep, terrified to leave, the fear locking me in my own house, a prisoner of my ancestors' failed pact. The desperate solutions I tried were pitifully useless. I attempted to reverse what was started. First, I tried to burn the journal, but the pages wouldn't catch fire, just blackening around the edges and releasing a thick, noxious smoke that smelled of sulfur. And then, I tried to put the granite seal back, driving hysterically to Greenleaf Cemetery, but when I reached the crypt, I couldn't remember where the seal was supposed to go. The stonework all looked the same, and the mausoleum door felt impossibly cold beneath my touch, and I sank to the ground, crying, feeling the weight of centuries of responsibility crushing me. And I finally called an old colleague of Aunt Beatrice's, a man named Mr. Hemlock, who was listed in the journal as her final apprentice. And he listened to my story, his voice heavy with resignation, and he said that the sleepwalker was awake, that the ritual was broken, and that there was nothing I could do now to stop it from claiming its right. The ongoing curse is my permanent reality. Mr. Hemlock told me that, because I broke the final seal, I became the new focal point, the anchor, and the only way the sleepwalker can be contained is if complete the failed ritual. But I don't know the exact steps, and every solution I try just makes things worse. And the sleepwalker is always there, not just in my house, but in the periphery of my life, and the permanent consequences are everywhere. I had to quit my job. I barely leave the house, and I can't look at old stones or hear the scrape of a shovel without breaking out in a cold sweat, and the proof that I can't escape is undeniable. Every morning when I wake up, there is a small, fresh pile of cemetery earth on my bedside table, right next to where the granite seal once was, a sign that the creature is getting closer, that it is crossing the threshold every single night. And the last time I went to the crypt to check on my Aunt Beatrice's resting place, the heavy marble door was slightly ajar, just a crack, and scrawled into the dust on the floor of the mausoleum, in Aunt Beatrice's distinctive, shaky script were the final, heartbreaking words. I had listed it. The Watcher is yours now, and I know I am trapped, destined to live out my life as the warden of a creature I cannot see and cannot stop. Story 50, the job setup was exactly what I needed. I was a specialized stone restoration professional, great at what I did, but between contract lulls and the general economic slump, I was desperate for work, and the money wasn't worth it. But the bills kept coming, so when I saw the posting for high-end historical stone cleaning and grave restoration at the exclusive, deeply private Rosewood Mausoleum Gardens, I jumped on it, and the pay offered was astronomical, far more than industry standard, with a massive signing bonus. And the only caveat, which they mentioned almost as an afterthought, was that the work had to be done exclusively between midnight and 6 a.m., and the contract they sent me was pages long, full of legal jargon, but I barely skimmed it, seeing only the final number. And the financial pressure was immense. I took the job immediately, ready to prove my worth and finally clear my debt. My first day was unsettling. The Rosewood Mausoleum Gardens were less of a cemetery and more of a fortress of the dead, surrounded by a 15-foot brick wall and secured with heavy, electronic gates. And I met my co-workers, a quiet, older man named Ben, who had eyes that looked perpetually tired, and a young woman, Maria, who avoided eye contact and only spoke in hurried whispers, and the initial training was strange. The supervisor, a man named Mr. Thorne, who wore immaculate, old-fashioned gloves, showed me the procedure: specialized, non-acidic chemical mixtures, low power pressure washers, and the insistence on silence, absolute silence. The residents require quiet, he said without a hint of irony, and he then pointed out the restricted areas, a section in the center marked by tall, black velvet ropes, saying that section was off limits, even for cleaning, which made no professional sense. A stone needs uniform care. But the money was too good to argue, so I nodded and began my work. The strange protocols became the norm. The rules made no sense in a professional context. We had to wear thick, noise-canceling headphones, even when not using the machinery, and we were required to clock our location every 30 minutes using a small, specialized GPS tracker they issued. And the most bizarre rule was the no-names policy. We were absolutely forbidden from speaking the names of the deceased whose stones we were cleaning, referring to them only by their plot number or the description of their monument, and Mr. Thorne made it clear that the focus must be on the stone, not the inhabitant, and I should have walked away then. The whole situation reeked of cult-like paranoia, and my professional obligation battled with my personal safety. But I kept repeating the contract amount in my head, focusing on the sheer volume of work I could accomplish, trying to rationalize it as eccentric rich people stuff, anything to ignore the growing dread. The coworker warning started subtly. Maria, the younger woman, cornered me one night by the main crypt, nervously cleaning the same small marble statue over and over, and she whispered, without looking at me, "They quit, the others." And I asked her who, and she just shook her head, repeating, "They quit. Fast one night they're here. The next day, nothing." And Ben, the older man, never spoke, but one night as I was walking past, I saw him pause, drop his brush, and very clearly, very slowly, make the sign of the cross against the polished stone of a massive, black tome. Something I knew was against the rules, and when he looked up, his eyes were full of a terrible, quiet desperation, and he just mouthed the word, "Ron," and then went back to his work with a renewed, almost frantic intensity. And the atmosphere was not professional. It was a silent theater of profound fear, and I knew that whatever was happening here, it wasn't about cleaning stone. The truth was revealed on a night. I was cleaning a section near the restricted area. I had just finished my round when I heard a low, metallic scraping sound coming from behind the black velvet ropes, and curiosity, or perhaps pure foolhardiness, won out, and I used a spare key I'd accidentally acquired to slip past the barrier, and I was immediately hit by the smell, a strong, sweet, sickening odor, and the ground was churned up, raw earth. And then I saw it. The job did not involve cleaning. It involved grave robbing, but not for treasure. I saw 3 figures, not Ben, Maria, or Mr. Thorne, dressed in the same uniform as us, working frantically around a freshly dug pit, and they were trying to lift a large, heavy crate out of the hole, and they were struggling, and I saw what the job really involves. They weren't restoring graves. They were managing a horrific, midnight transfer operation, and then the topic horror as they managed to lift the crate. The lid shifted just enough, and I saw a flash of pale, waxy skin and black hair, and I realized they were moving bodies, but not just bodies. They were moving fresh bodies, their faces preserved in a look of ultimate terror, and the horrifying implication hit me: the residents weren't just the dead. They were the recently dead, and they were being moved, or perhaps delivered, in the middle of the night. I was trapped immediately. I stumbled back, making a noise, and one of the figures instantly looked up, their face pale and expressionless, and they saw me, and I ran straight back to the security shed, trying to call the police, but my phone was dead, completely useless, and the next morning, Mr. Thorne was waiting for me at the gate, not angry, but calm, his eyes holding a terrifying certainty, and he smiled and said, "A shame about your phone, Jessica. Seems the network here is quite unreliable." And he then gently tapped the contract I had signed. You know, the penalty clause for early termination is quite severe. It states you can't work in this industry, anywhere in the country, for 10 years, and then there's the repayment of the signing bonus, immediately, plus interest. and he made it clear that I was unable to quit due to contract's threats, that I was forced participation, not because of a gun, but because of my debt, because of my career. And he said, "Now, go get some rest. We have a very important delivery tonight, and the stones will need to be spotless for the new resident." And the money wasn't worth it, but I was trapped, working under the silent eyes of the people I was now helping to move. The escape and consequences took months of planning. I finally got out by faking a severe, debilitating injury, a complex break that required immediate, long-term care and multiple surgeries, and I knew they wouldn't risk an injured person, a liability, especially one who might talk in the hospital. And they let me go coldly, without a word, and I got out. But I am forever changed and marked by that place. I will never work in stone restoration again. The smell of cleaning chemicals sends me into a cold panic, and I look at every tombstone, every cemetery, and only see a potential container, a vessel waiting for its next silent transfer, and the consequence is permanent. The careered life permanently altered by the experience. The money I made is long gone, eaten up by medical bills, and I'm always looking over my shoulder. But the worst part is the final, chilling reminder. A few weeks ago, I received a package from an anonymous sender, and inside was a perfect, small replica of a white marble gravestone, about the size of my thumb, and on the face, etched in tiny, precise letters, was my name, Jessica Lee Allen, and a date of death, exactly 10 years from the day I signed that contract. And below it, the words "Do IT Fendry Far Retirement." And I know that Mr. Thorne is still out there, that the transfers are still happening, and that Rosewood is waiting patiently for my return. Story 60, my encounter setup was as mundane as it gets. I was enjoying my retirement, mostly spending my days on my lifelong hobby-long, aimless walks, and my daily routine was usually a quiet stroll through the town's historic district, which always included cutting through the old, beautiful St. Agnes burial ground, a massive, peaceful cemetery filled with ancient oaks and ivy-covered angels. And I was never one for ghost stories. I was a practical man, a former accountant, and I enjoyed the quiet, the history, the stillness of the place. But one sunny Tuesday morning, my routine was abruptly interrupted by a cemetery-related anomaly, a small, dark shape resting right on the perfectly manicured lawn in the center of the path. And it was a single black feather, impossibly long, like nothing I had ever seen, and I picked it up, feeling a weird, cold prickle run up my arm, and I tossed it away, dismissing it as just a strange bird, and walked on. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a deep, uncomfortable coldness that the morning sun couldn't touch. My initial curiosity got the better of me the next day. The same black feather was back, in the exact same spot, and this time, I explored the strange occurrence, looking up into the old oaks, searching for a bird, but there was nothing, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an unnerving silence, and I picked it up again, feeling that coldness deepen, and I decided to keep it, slipping it into my jacket pocket, telling myself it was a fun little oddity. And I should have been surprised when the whispers started that night, faint, indistinct sounds that seemed to come from the hallway, just outside my closed bedroom door, and they were subtle supernatural hints, not words, just a low, sighing sound, and I told myself it was the heating system, or my imagination, dismissing it as a trick of the mind that old men sometimes suffer from. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were about me, that they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. The first signs were deeply unsettling. On my walk the following day, the shadows in St. Agnes seemed deeper, moving faster than they should, even in the midday sun, and I noticed that the statues, the marble angels and sorrowful figures, seemed to be following me with their eyes. A childish delusion, I told myself, but the effect was so strong I had to look away, and the subtle supernatural hints intensified. I started seeing fleeting shapes in the windows of my house, dark, tall figures that vanished the moment I turned to look directly at them, and the whispers, tied to the cemetery, grew louder, sometimes sounding like my name being called, but in a voice that was too thin, too high-pitched to be real, and I couldn't believe what was happening. I was a rational man, and my sanity was starting to feel like a glass breaking under a slow, steady pressure, and I started checking the doors, the windows, convinced there was a person in the house. But there never was. only the chilling reality that the fear was coming from within, or perhaps from the feather in my pocket. The growing manifestations became a sensory overload, a horrific descent into the unreal. A week later, I was woken in the middle of the night by the distinct, loud sound of scraping, like stone on stone, coming from my bedroom, and the intense apparition was standing in the corner, a figure of pure shadow, tall and gaunt, its outline somehow darker than the room itself, and the air around it was impossibly cold, and it had 2 points of faint, flickering red light where its eyes should be, and the scraping was its fingers, impossibly long and pointed, slowly dragging across the plaster wall. And I couldn't move, the sheer terror locking my muscles, and I smelled something terrible, the sickly, sweet scent of wet earth and decay, and the smell, the cold, the sight, the sound, it all combined into a brutal, overwhelming attack on my senses, and I was questioning reality, asking myself if I was having a stroke, if this was the final, terrifying breakdown of my mind. But the figure was too solid, the scraping too real, and I saw a thin line of gray dust falling from the wall, where its fingers had touched. The revelation came the next morning. Shaking and exhausted, I looked at the damage. There was a visible deep gouge in the plaster wall, solid proof, and the feather was gone from my jacket pocket, vanished, and I remembered my Aunt Clara mentioning a local legend about St. Agnes, about a figure called the Scrivener, an old spirit tied to the cemetery, a creature that collected the names of those who disturbed the quiet of the graves. And I rushed to the library, digging through old town histories, finally uncovering the supernatural entity's true connection to the cemetery. The Scrivener wasn't a guardian, it was a predator, and its legend said that once it focused on a person, it left a feather, and it would then scrape their name onto a stone that only it could see, slowly, painfully, until the person died. And the longer the scraping, the more agonizing the death, and the Scrivener only appeared when the living brought something from the dead's realm into their own. And that's when it hit me. The feather was the invitation. The granite pieces in my neighbor's house, the strange things Aunt Beatrice collected, it was all connected to this thing that was collecting names, and now it had mine. The confrontation was brief and utterly terrifying. That evening, the shadow was back, standing silently by my bed, and I finally found my voice yelling, "Leave me alone!" I didn't want the feather, and the shadow didn't move, but the whispering started, louder now, and I could hear my name, Arthur, being stretched and distorted. And I realized it wasn't a fight I could win, it was flight. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my car keys and ran, fleeing my own house, and I drove straight out of town, not looking back, knowing that whatever I was running from, I couldn't outrun, and I checked into a cheap motel 60 miles away, trying desperately to feel safe. But the fear was a living thing in the passenger seat, and the knowledge of my name being scraped onto some invisible, cold stone was worse than any immediate threat, and the encounter left me profoundly scarred, forever haunted by the memory of those red, flickering eyes. With the lingering haunt as my current reality, I tried to go back home, but I couldn't even make it past the front gate, the fear paralyzing me, and I sold everything remotely connected to St. Agnes, even the historical books, and I moved to a quiet, isolated town hundreds of miles away. But the effects are ongoing. I can't look at old stones, I can't sleep without a light on, and I constantly hear the faint, low whispering in the corners of every room, and the chilling proof that the entity persists came just 2 weeks ago. I was sitting on a park bench, hundreds of miles from St. Agnes, enjoying the evening air, and I looked down at the concrete sidewalk, and there it was, a single, impossibly long, black feather, resting right at my feet, and I looked up, instantly, frantically, and across the street, standing in the shadow of a large, old oak tree, was a figure, tall and gaunt, its outline subtly darker than the night, and as the street light flickered, I saw the faint, telltale flicker of red light in its eyes, and the sound started, faint, distant, but undeniable, a slow, soft, agonizing sound of something dragging against something hard, scraping, 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 and I knew that the Scrivener had found me, and that it was still working on my name. Story 7A. My routine setup involved my bike, and the fastest way home from school, and the most efficient route cut directly through the old, forgotten section of Oak Hill Cemetery, which was a massive, sprawling place, and my mom told me not to use it, saying it was disrespectful. But it shaved a crucial 10 minutes off my commute, which meant more time to play my favorite video game, so I used the cemetery path every day, weaving my little purple mountain bike between the cracked headstones and under the weeping willows, and it was a peaceful, if slightly spooky, part of my normal life, and I was always racing the clock, so I barely paid attention to the silent, stone inhabitants, just the path, the shortcut, and the clock, until the day my normal life shattered, and the peaceful routine became a terrifying daily pursuit. The first notice of something being wrong happened subtly, a minor, easily dismissed coincidence. I was riding home, taking my usual turn past the imposing Black Angel statue, a massive, weeping figure in the middle of a small, grassy island, and I felt it, the distinct, prickling feeling of being watched. And I looked around, slowing down, but I only saw the silent stones, the quiet trees and the light fading, and then, a few days later, I was checking my bike in the garage, and I noticed something odd, a tiny, dark smear of mud on the silver reflector, just a small thing, but it was fresh mud, and the smear looked exactly like the dark, sticky, reddish earth from the oldest, wettest part of the cemetery, the part I went through, and I remember thinking, weird. I wiped my bike down yesterday, but I just shrugged it off, trying to rationalize it as something I missed. But the feeling of being observed, of someone seeing me when I didn't see them, began to twist the familiar cemetery into something deeply unsettling. The escalating surveillance became proof of something terrifying. The feeling of being watched intensified. And one afternoon, I found evidence of stalking, a small, dark object tucked into the spokes of my front wheel, a tiny, folded piece of paper, and I unfolded it, my hands shaking a little, and written on the paper, in perfectly neat, spidery handwriting were 3 words, Sloo Duo Wn, Kilo E, and my stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about my shortcut, and no one from school knew where I lived. And then, the sightings started, not of a person, but of a specific car, a beat-up, dark blue pickup truck, parked outside the cemetery gates every afternoon, always parked in a different spot, always facing a different direction, but it was always the same truck. And one day, I saw a flash of light reflecting off the windshield, like a camera lens catching the sun, and the technology used by the stalker was simple but effective. I realized the truck was watching me, timing my movements, learning my routine, and the constant feeling of being monitored started to distort my everyday life, making every shadow a hiding place, every parked car a threat. The identification of the motive, if not the person, came from a sickening discovery. I had been searching for a hidden camera or a sign inside the cemetery when I stumbled upon a small, crudely dug hole near the base of the Black Angel statue, and inside was a small, plastic lunchbox, and I opened it, my heart pounding, and inside were dozens of Polaroid photos, all of me, riding my bike through the cemetery, sometimes close up, sometimes from a distance, all taken without my knowledge, and I was horrified. But then I noticed the common element. Every photo was centered around the Black Angel statue, and I finally discovered the stalker's motive tied to the cemetery, a strange, obsessive focus on that one statue. And one of the Polaroids had writing on the back, the same spidery script, Seishi St Guardians DHDR, and the realization hit me, a sickening wave of nausea. The stalker wasn't interested in me as Chloe. They were interested in me because of the cemetery, because they believed I had some kind of dark, twisted connection to the Black Angel, and I should have known better than to think a shortcut through a graveyard was harmless. The chase sequence was pure, adrenaline, fueled horror. I jumped back on my bike, desperate to escape, when I saw the blue pickup truck pull up right at the end of the path, blocking the exit, and a figure got out, tall and bulky, dressed in dark clothing. And the pursuit began in a cemetery, specific setting. Weaving between the monuments, I pedaled frantically, the tires of my bike skidding on the damp earth, hearing the heavy thump of the stalker's feet pounding the ground behind me, and I tried to cut through the tight rows of small, upright stones, the ones that were close together, knowing my bike was faster and more agile than the stalker. And I remember looking back once, seeing the figure pause at the Black Angel statue, not to catch its breath, but to look at the statue, almost in reverence, before continuing the pursuit. and my mind was racing, screaming at me. The signs were all there, and the chase was not just physical. It was a terrifying violation of my safe place, my sanctuary. The resolution attempt was born of desperation. I managed to shake the stalker by ditching my bike near a large, thorny rosebush and scrambling over the old, crumbling brick wall, tearing my jeans and scraping my knees, but I didn't care, and I ran straight home, barricaded myself in my room, and immediately told my mother everything, showing her the photo and the note, seeking help from the only person I trusted, and my mom, terrified and protective, called the police, and the confrontation escape was messy. The police investigated the area, finding the abandoned bike and the lunchbox, but the stalker was gone, and the blue pickup truck was nowhere to be found, and the officer, a kindly woman, tried to reassure me, saying it was likely just a weirdo who got scared off, but the unresolved feeling was overwhelming, because the police couldn't tell me who the stalker was, or why they thought I was the guardian's daughter. That the continued vigilance is my life now. I never ride my bike through the cemetery again, and my parents drive me everywhere, but the sense of being watched never leaves, and the terror has settled into a cold, constant paranoia. And the recent indications the stalker hasn't stopped are the most terrifying part. 2 months after the chase, a fresh clue appeared. I was taking my dog for a walk in a completely different neighborhood, miles from the cemetery, when I saw it, etched roughly into the dry cement of the sidewalk. A small, circular drawing of the Black Angel statue, and tucked beneath a nearby lamppost was a tiny, faded Polaroid, and I recognized the spidery handwriting on the back immediately, scrawled in faint blue ink. A single terrifying line, W.E.M.S.U.A.T. Homigard Ines Dikartar T.H.E. Angel Willipasa. And I know that the stalker is still out there watching, waiting for me to return to the quiet of Oak Hill Cemetery. Waiting for the day I finally accept my legacy. And the terror is that I'll never know if the threat is a lone madman or something older, something truly tied to the silence of the graves. Story 80. The acquisition setup was fueled by teenage boredom and a dumb dare. My friends and I, always looking for something edgy to do on a Friday night, decided to break into the old, abandoned Northgate Cemetery, a place notorious for its unsettling atmosphere and local legends about strange happenings. And we weren't looking for trouble, just a cheap thrill. Something to talk about in school on Monday, and the dare was simple: bring back a relic from the oldest section, something undeniably from the graveyard, and I found it near the back wall. Half buried in the dirt, a small heavy stone plaque, about the size of my hand, and the cursed object I acquired was clearly tied to the cemetery, a small obsidian black stone, perfectly smooth, with a single, complex symbol carved into its center, a strange, interlocking spiral that looked disturbingly like a sleeping eye, and I should have known better. The stone was cold, impossibly cold, even on a warm summer night, but the rush of having actually done the dare, of owning a piece of a forgotten cemetery, was too intoxicating to ignore. My initial fascination quickly turned into a strange, unsettling dependence. I cleaned the plaque meticulously, discovering that when held, the stone seemed to hum faintly, and I used the object almost like a strange, macabre stone, carrying it everywhere, and I felt a strange rush of good fortune, a series of minor, positive effects that I immediately linked to the stone. I aced a pop quiz I hadn't studied for. My crush actually smiled and talked to me in the hall, and I started winning every coin toss, every small gamble with my friends, and I examined the object in detail. The cemetery ties were evident in the faint smell of damp earth and moss that clung to it, and I convinced myself that this wasn't a cursed relic, but a lucky charm, something powerful and personal, a secret weapon against the randomness of my life. And I became deeply attached to the object, sleeping with it under my pillow. The coldness of the stone, the last thing I felt every night. The first curses started subtly, minor misfortunes that I immediately blamed on bad luck. Not the stone. I started getting into tiny, stupid accidents, tripping in the hallway and spraining my ankle, getting into a fender bender where I was clearly not at fault, and my little sister's beloved pet hamster suddenly died, which was sad, but just life, I thought. And then, the incident started to affect the people around me in small, cruel ways. My best friend Alex, who had been there when I found the stone, suddenly got violently ill, a strange, feverish sickness that the doctors couldn't identify, and he kept whispering about a cold hand and seeing shadows, and I tried to talk to him, but he just stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, and I started to feel this growing, cold dread, the kind of dread that makes the back of your neck prickle. And I began to suspect that the object and the cemetery were connected in a way I couldn't ignore. A growing chain of bad luck that seemed to follow me everywhere. The worsening effects became undeniable and severe. My small misfortunes turned into terrifying, life-changing incidents linked directly to the object in the cemetery. I was home alone one night, the stone resting on my desk, when the lights in my room suddenly exploded, shattering glass everywhere, and the resulting fire was minor, but it destroyed my prized guitar, the one I had saved up for years to buy, and the damage was clearly focused around the stone, which was sitting untouched in the center of the charred mess. And then the worst thing happened. Alex's illness worsened dramatically, and his doctors were talking about permanent damage, and he would only communicate by writing. And the last note he wrote, shaky and barely legible, said, "The stone is hungry, Jake. Put it back, it wants the names." And the true horror of the situation hit me. The good luck I had experienced was a trade, and the stone was drawing energy, drawing life from the people around me, and I couldn't believe I had brought this thing into my life, that I had been so blind. The origin discovery was a terrifying race against time. I knew I had to get rid of the thing, but first I needed to understand what it was, and I used the local historical society's archives, specifically a collection of old, brittle Northgate cemetery records, and I researched the curse's history, finding a reference to the strange, spiral symbol carved into the stone, and it was the symbol of an ancient, pre-colonial burial sect who believed that certain stones, carved with that symbol, acted as anchors, trapping the unsettled dead, the most violent, restless spirits, and the text said the anchors had to be buried periodically, or the spirit they contained would slowly leach the life force from the anchor's holder, and those closest to them, a kind of slow feast. And the most chilling part was a handwritten note in the margin of the text, a warning from a local minister in the 1890s. They must be returned before the full cycle is complete, or the curse lingers. And I knew that the full cycle was about to complete, and that I was the new target. The disposal attempt was chaotic and failed spectacularly. I tried everything I could think of to destroy the object. First, I tried to smash it with a sledgehammer, but the hammer simply bounced off the black surface, leaving no mark. And then I tried to burn it, dosing it in gasoline. But the stone wouldn't catch fire. Instead, the gasoline formed a strange, oily film around it, and the air around it grew impossibly cold, freezing the surrounding grass. And my final, desperate attempt to rid the object was to return it to Northgate. But when I arrived, the iron gates were locked, the chains impossibly thick, and as I stood there, holding the cold, heavy stone, a small, faint voice whispered in my ear, "You can't leave me, Jake. We're bound now." And I realized that the stone wasn't just a container. It was the focus of the curse, and it had formed an irreversible attachment to me, making it clear that I was its new, permanent home. Too, the persistent curse is now my life's shadow. I couldn't get rid of the object, so I buried it deep in my backyard, wrapped in chains and concrete. But the curse lingers, and the strange phenomena didn't stop, and the persistent curse affects my current life irreversibly. I still carry the coldness with me, a constant, deep chill in my bones that no blanket or fire can warm, and my relationships are ruined. My friends and family are worried about my constant bad luck and the strange accidents that follow me, and Alex, my best friend, is still recovering, forever changed by the mystery illness that almost killed him. And the irreversible consequence is the knowledge that the curse is not the stone, but the connection the stone made. And the final, terrifying manifestation happened last night. I woke up to find the stone, which I had buried under 3 feet of earth and concrete, resting on my chest, perfectly clean and cold, and etched around the spiral symbol, barely visible in the dark, were 3 new, tiny symbols, one for my father, one for my mother, and the last one, the smallest and freshest, for me. And I know that the cycle is complete, that the stone is feasting, and that the only thing keeping the creature in the cemetery is my own declining life force. Story 90. The trigger setup was my pursuit of perfect, atmospheric art. I was a struggling artist, and my newest project required intense, total immersion in my subject matter, which was the beauty of perpetual decay, and for weeks, I spent every waking hour in the oldest, most ignored section of the city's massive, beautiful pioneer cemetery, sketching the crumbling monuments and painting the shadows under the huge, ancient weeping willows. And this immersion in the topic, while artistically fulfilling, led to intense stress and profound isolation. I stopped seeing friends, stopped answering calls, pushing myself to work through the night, fueled by black coffee and the strange, quiet beauty of the place, trying to capture the feeling of the stones whispering their secrets. And I should have walked away, but the need to create, the hunger for perfect art, was all-consuming, and the money wasn't worth the price I paid for that perfect shadow. The initial strain began subtly, minor mental slips, and the fatigue from topic involvement were constant companions. I was living on 4 hours of sleep, and I started having trouble distinguishing my sketches from my memories, confusing the lines I drew with the lines of the real world, and I would spend hours staring at a monument, convinced I had already drawn it, only to find the paper completely blank, and my internal monologue, once sharp and focused, became a constant, low, argumentative hum. A second voice that kept pointing out the flaws in my work, the shadows I missed, the stones that were looking at me, and I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision, quick, dark flashes behind the headstones. But every time I turned, there was nothing, and the stress was immense, an invisible weight pressing down on my mind, and I knew I was tired, but I pushed harder, convinced that the key to my artistic breakthrough was just one more late night, one more perfect drawing. The hallucinations begin with a terrifying loss of control. I was trying to sketch the massive, stone angel near the cemetery's main crypt, a beautiful figure with its head bowed, and I looked down at my pad, and the blur of reality with topic-induced visions was complete. The angel's face in my sketch was no longer bowed. It was looking directly at me, its eyes wide and empty, and I stared at the sketch, terrified, knowing I hadn't drawn it that way, and I tried to erase it, but the pencil lines were too deep. And then, the sound started, not whispers, but a low, hollow groaning that seemed to come from inside the crypt itself, and the air around me felt thick, suffocating, and I heard a voice, clear and cold, say, "You see the truth now, Claire. You belong here." And I couldn't believe what was happening. I dropped my pencil, scrambling backward, and the doubt about my sanity began, a cold, hard knot in my chest, telling me that I was finally losing it, that the lack of sleep and the isolation had finally broken my mind. And the scariest part was the voice sounded exactly like the one in my internal monologue, the one criticizing my art. The deep descent was a terrifying period of confusion. Every time I went to the cemetery, the visions became more vivid, more real. I saw the stone statues weeping real, dark tears, and I would find small, white, perfect human teeth scattered on the ground near my favorite monuments. But when I tried to pick them up, they vanished, leaving only wet mud, and I was fully confused, unable to tell real threats from illusions. I saw a woman in a long, dark dress standing by the mausoleum every night, always standing still, always facing away, and one night I yelled at her, demanding she leave, and she slowly turned, and her face was a smooth, white marble mask, exactly like the statue I had been drawing, and I realized the threat was real, or at least, my mind believed it was real, and the whole world became unreliable, a constantly shifting canvas of terror, and I stopped sleeping altogether, convinced that if I closed my eyes, the white-faced woman would be standing over me. The external help was painful and embarrassing. My best friend, Marcus, hadn't heard from me in a week, and he finally showed up at my studio, forcing his way in, and he found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by my sketches, arguing heatedly with an empty corner. Convinced the white-faced woman was standing there, and he immediately called my parents, describing my breakdown to friends experts who were horrified, and they intervened, rushing me to the hospital, and I remember fighting them, screaming that they couldn't take me, that the stones were watching, and I had to finish the painting, and the doctors diagnosed me with severe psychosis, brought on by extreme stress and sleep deprivation, and the first few weeks were a blur of medication and confusion. the internal monologue slowly being silenced, the hallucinations fading to just bad memories. But the images, the marble face, the teeth, were burned into my mind. The partial recovery left me questioning everything. After months of therapy and medication, I was released, stable, functional, but not whole. And the biggest question was, what was real? Was it the breakdown? Or was the breakdown a reaction to something as actually being there? I went back to the cemetery once, hesitantly, and everything looked normal, quiet, peaceful. But I felt the coldness, the silence, and I noticed that the stone angel's face, the one that I had been drawing, had a new, small, perfectly clean fissure running from its right eye, like a single, dried tear track. And I knew that something had changed, that my mind had touched something real in that place, and I had paid the price for that brief, terrifying look behind the curtain. And I stopped painting altogether, terrified to look at a blank canvas, terrified of what my mind might draw into existence. The recurring episodes are a terrifying reality. I haven't had a full breakdown since, but the episodes are tied to the cemetery. A recent relapse that reminds me the ghost of the place is still with me. I was walking through a busy downtown park last month, far away from Pioneer Cemetery, and I looked down at the sidewalk, and I saw a tiny, perfect, white human tooth resting innocently on the concrete, and I instantly felt the coldness, the silence, and the voice. The internal monologue came back, clear and cold, whispering, still missing the shadow's glare. The marble waits, and the doubt about my full recovery is constant. I now carry a small vial of holy water wherever I go, a piece of irrational comfort that the rational part of me despises, but the irrational part needs. And the most recent episode was just 2 days ago. I was looking through a photo album, trying to remember what my life was like before the cemetery, and I came across an old photo of Marcus and me, and in the corner, just barely visible in the dark background, was a pale, long-limbed shadow, and on the back of the photo, written in a strange, elegant script that wasn't mine, were 2 words. ICTRY? And I know that the white-faced woman, the scrivener, whatever it was, is still out there, that the cemetery is still calling, and that my mind is the perfect, open doorway. Story done. The isolation setup was intentional. I was a professional explorer, specializing in forgotten historical sites, and I had been hired by a private foundation to conduct a complete survey and map an undocumented, heavily overgrown area rumored to be the site of an early 19th century settler cemetery, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. And I was deep in the woods, hours from the nearest road, completely alone, and I felt confident. I had my gear, my mapping tools, and my extensive survival training, and I was stranded or trapped in a cemetery-related environment. The wilderness being the first layer of defense, and the promise of uncovering a lost piece of history was too tempting to resist, and I set up my small, green two-person tent near a massive, ancient oak tree, which I was using as a landmark, feeling the thrill of the isolated challenge, ready to put my skills to the test. My initial assessment was cautious and professional. I took stock of the terrain, planning my survival strategies around the dense forest, water source, and the specific challenges of the cemetery, which was mostly unmarked field stones and shallow depressions in the earth. And my primary concern was the lack of visibility due to the thick brush, making the mapping slow and difficult, and I used a specialized ground-penetrating radar unit, a sophisticated tool for finding the unmarked graves, and I felt in control, charting the hidden rows, marking the suspected burial sites with small, bright orange flags. And for the first few hours, it was just work, a slow, methodical uncovering of the forgotten dead, and I was already mentally writing my final report. Pleased with my progress, the exhaustion a welcome sign of hard work. The first challenges were environmental, quickly followed by the profoundly unsettling. The weather turned violently cold, a sudden unexpected drop in temperature that stole the heat right out of my tent. And the environmental threats were tied to the cemetery. A thick, suffocating fog rolled in from the dense undergrowth, so thick I could barely see the orange flags I had planted 10 feet away. And the fog wasn't just cold, it smelled strangely sweet, like decaying flowers and something metallic. And then the noise started, a low, drought groan that echoed through the trees. A sound I initially dismissed as the wind, but the sound was too resonant, too close to the ground. and I should have been surprised when the first of my orange flags went missing, vanished from the fog. But I just felt a cold dread, a terrifying intuition that something was not happy I was there, that something was actively removing the markers I was placing. The escalating dangers were immediate and personal. I was already physically and emotionally exhausted from fighting the cold and the fog, and I realized I was lost. The fog was playing tricks on my sense of direction, and the loud, groaning sound was now closer, a distinct, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the wet earth. And then, the pursuits began. I saw a large, dark shape move through the fog, fast and low to the ground, and I scrambled backward, grabbing my pack, and I was sure it was an animal, a bear or a coyote, until I saw the damage. My tent, which I had just packed up, had been violently torn open, a massive, clean rip in the nylon, and inside my specialized radar unit. The most expensive piece of equipment I had been systematically smashed, the screen cracked, the delicate wires pulled out, a clear sign of intelligent, malicious intent. And the worsening conditions were not just the cold, but the absolute, paralyzing fear that I was being hunted by something that didn't want to be found. The desperate measures I took were risky and driven by pure survival instinct. I should have been surprised when I heard the low, guttural breathing right behind me, but I wasn't. I just reacted, dropping my main pack, grabbing only my knife and my satellite phone, and I started running blindly through the thick fog, crashing through the brush. And the pursuit was relentless, a heavy, dragging sound that followed my every step, and I used my survival technique specific to the cemetery. I ran across the shallow burial depressions, hoping the uneven ground would slow my pursuer, and I ran toward the massive oak tree, my original landmark, and I used my knife to carve a deep, fast spiral into the bark of the tree, hoping to mark my location for rescue, a desperate signal in the overwhelming white fog. And I ran until my lungs burned and my legs were screaming, pushing past the pain, knowing that stopping meant being caught by whatever was breathing that cold, wet air behind me. And I kept saying to myself, looking back though, that was the moment I stopped being an explorer and started being prey. The rescue or escape was a blurry miracle. I stumbled out of the thickest patch of fog, practically collapsing onto the narrow, unused logging road, and I managed to dial the satellite phone, screaming my coordinates into the phone, just seconds before the battery died, and I was found 6 hours later by a park ranger, hypothermic, scratched, and mentally shattered, but free. I had broken free, but I was scarred, physically and emotionally, and I was taken to a small clinic, and the authorities tried to rationalize the damage, saying it was a bear, but I knew what I felt, what I heard, and I knew no animal could have ripped my tent so cleanly, and the ongoing trauma is a heavy, constant presence. I had to give up my career. The thought of being alone in the woods again sends me into a crippling panic attack, and I have recurring nightmares of being lost in the sweet, smelling fog, hearing the heavy, dragging sound, and the recent triggers reminding me of the ordeal are the worst part. I can't look at an orange object without feeling sick, and the permanent scar that reminds me every day is the wound on my forearm, a deep, thick, perfectly clean laceration, and the final sign that the ordeal isn't over came just last week. I was looking at the photo the rescue team took of the massive oak tree to confirm my location, and carved into the bark, right beneath the spiral I carved, was a new, zip line, deep and dark, and etched right next to my desperate spiral was the word, clean and unforgiving, STI. And I know that the lost cemetery is still out there, and it still wants its map and its silence